I now have the honor to invite Madam Amina Mohammed, the Honorable Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, to deliver her remarks for the commemoration of this day. Deputy Secretary General, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, USG Lou. It's a real pleasure to be here with everyone, and I wanted to stand here rather than there because I quite like to be next to this poster. This really demonstrates for us the message to everyone on this very special day that we still are very much a center of what will work for our 2030 agenda. Pleased to welcome everyone to this celebration of the International Day of the World Indigenous People. Let me say in the voices of my people, barka da zuwa. Muna murnan ganin ku daga bisa wannan labarin da zamu yi, muna kuma fatan al'adarmu zamu yi mu samu mu yi mu gama lafiya. And what I'm saying is welcoming you, but also praying that we will have a spirit of friendship and of respect for our many indigenous inheritances of our culture and of our way of life. Today is an opportunity to acknowledge the diversity and the wealth of knowledge of indigenous people that we possess and to recognize the richness that they bring to humankind. There are estimated 370 million indigenous people in the world today, and they're making their voices heard on many, many fronts. Indigenous women and men are advocating for sustainable livelihoods from one generation to another. They are defending biodiversity and the integrity of ecosystems and raising the alarm over the growing impacts of climate disruption. In the lead up to the Paris Agreement in 2015, Indigenous people spoke about Mother Earth, a concept that encapsulates the wisdom and that humankind has neglected and that is now featured in the Paris Agreement as an equivalent to climate justice. Together, Indigenous people are mobilizing to defend their way of life, cultures, languages, which are often rooted in harmony with the natural world. This year marks the International Year of Indigenous Languages, declared by the United Nations General Assembly to draw attention to the urgent need to preserve, revitalize, and promote our indigenous languages. Almost half the world's estimated 6,700 languages are in danger of disappearing. Many of those belong to indigenous people. With every language that disappears, a world loses a wealth of traditional knowledge and cultural heritage. Education will have a pivotal role to play in ensuring that indigenous people can enjoy and preserve their culture and identity. Intercultural and multilingual education will be necessary to prevent the irreparable loss. Failure to provide multilingual and intercultural education puts indigenous people at a disadvantage, threatening their very survival. This year, under the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, we looked at how we are advancing towards the achievement of the SDGs. In particular, we looked at the progress around the following 6 goals. Sustainable Development Goal 4, which emphasizes the importance of relevant, equitable, and inclusive education. SDG 8 on sustainable and inclusive growth and employment. SDG 10 calling for reduced inequalities, and SDG 13 underscoring the urgent action needed to combat climate change and its impacts. SDG 16 promoting peaceful and inclusive societies, access to justice and accountable institutions, and then as always SDG 17, which seeks to strengthen our means of implementation and the partnerships and collaborations that are needed to sustain it. These goals are closely linked to today's observance of the International Day of Indigenous People. On this International Day, we must remember and highlight that Indigenous peoples in many parts of the world still do not enjoy their very basic rights. They endure systemic discrimination and exclusion, which threatens their way of life, cultures, and identities. Such barriers are compounded for Indigenous women and girls who also face gender-based violence and discrimination. The promise of the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals is to leave no one behind and really to reach the furthest behind first. We must make every effort to enable Indigenous people to enjoy their full rights as enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Taken together, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the outcome document of the 2014 World Conference on Indigenous People, and the 2030 Agenda form the frameworks and tools required to close the gap between our words and actions. Some member states are taking steps to revitalize and strengthen Indigenous languages. We are encouraged by these efforts and call on other countries to do so in close cooperation with Indigenous people. We must do more for the languages to flourish so we may retain the wealth and knowledge and cultures that are part of this world's rich diversity. That is our strength and not our weakness. I count on the political will of member states to support Indigenous peoples in determining their own development through policies that are inclusive, equitable, and accessible. Indigenous people must be engaged in every step of the process, from conceptualizing the idea all the way through to implementing it. The UN stands ready to support all initiatives aimed at realizing the rights and aspirations of Indigenous people, including through its system-wide action plan on the rights of Indigenous people. On this International Day, let us reaffirm our commitment to work together to realize those rights of Indigenous people sooner rather than later. And as the IPCC report comes out today and focuses on land degradation, it is really important to re-emphasize that we will and cannot stand for those who are human rights defenders of our environments, of our habitat, that are persecuted. And really we should put a stop to that, a zero tolerance for it. And I think on this day, really remember those who have gone down fighting for the rights of Indigenous people and their habitat. I thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary General, for your remarks. We're delighted to have you with us today, and thank you for reminding us that we must do more for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous languages to flourish and retain the wealth of knowledge, cultures, livelihoods, and practice that are part of the world's biodiversity.